Just say some whatever you want.
AJ, looking mighty fine today. Hey, this is Jack Beckman, driver of John Force's Peak Chevrolet Camaro SS. For 14 years, I made a living as a professional nitro funny car driver, and I raced against John Force plenty of times. Sponsorship ran out at the end of 2020. I went back to fixing elevators. 3 years and 9 months later, my phone rang saying, "Can you fill in for John for the rest of the year?" So I still fix elevators. That's my 9 to 5 job, but on weekends I drive the coolest car on wheels. My parents met while cruising Van Nuys Boulevard, so I think needless to say they were hot rodders and gearheads. My Uncle John took my brother and I to my first drag race. I believe it was 1973 at Orange County International Raceway right here in Southern California. I was 7 years old and I was hooked instantly. The sights, the sounds, the smells, the people. If you've been to a drag race, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But if you're 7 years old and you go to a drag race, everything's magnified tenfold. The drivers were 8 feet tall. The cars were just amazing. And I knew this was something I wanted to be a part of. Fast forward to me being a high school dropout and not quite sure what I wanted to do for a living. So I enlisted in the United States Air Force. I spent 4 years and I was honorably discharged as a sergeant. And during that time, I took my first car, my 1968 Chevrolet El Camino SS 396, drove it 100 miles out to Lubbock, Texas, and I made my first run down the drag strip. So I went from being a super fan to all of a sudden being a competitor. And when I got out of the Air Force in '88, that's what I did in my spare time. I took the car to the drag strip. I did everything I could to tinker with it. I wanted to make it faster. I wanted to make it go down that drag strip better. And I eventually progressed into a used dragster, and then I built a new Super Comp dragster. I enrolled in the Frank Hawley Drag Racing School in '97 because I wasn't rich, I didn't have a famous last name, and I knew I wanted to drive cars with nitro in the tank. So at the Hawley School, I got my license in top alcohol dragster. And ironically, that led to a job offer from Frank. So in 1998, I quit my job as an elevator repairman. I took a cut in pay and I became a full-time drag race instructor. I never quit that job. From '98 to 2008, I taught the classes at Pomona Raceway. We closed down that location and strictly run out of Gainesville now. I still work with Frank on occasion, but it's not a full-time job. Well, in 2006, I got another job driving a nitro funny car. I still taught all the classes at the school. And in 2008, when the Pomona location was winding down, my full-time job for the next 14 years was driving a nitro funny car. And of all the moments in driving nitro funny cars, I think the two that are at the top of the list are anytime I lined up next to John Force. And I told people back then, back 18 years ago, I said, I get to tell my grandkids I raced against John Force. I didn't realize he'd keep racing for 20 more years. And then lining up next to Frank Hawley, who was coming back on a part-time basis and actually getting to compete against him in a funny car final round in Reading, Pennsylvania. Those are just pinch me moments. Like I go back to that 7-year-old kid on the fence at Orange County watching these unbelievable machines and thinking, boy, would it be cool one day to be one of those people in those nitro cars. And as you get older, and I was racing my car and I got to drive some faster cars, but sometimes that dream seems like it's just too far out of reach. I was an elevator guy, I didn't have a lot of money. And just perseverance and meeting the right people, making the right connections, and it happened. And I got to do this full time for 14 years. And when that ended at the end of 2020, because of the sponsorships and COVID, I thought that was it. I got more than I ever asked for. I got more than I ever dreamed I was going to get, and that's all I'm going to get. And I went back to fixing elevators. But God, did I miss it. I'd go to the Pomona races twice a year, and I still had tons of friends in the racing industry, but it's just not the same thing. You know, I always said I'm a great fan. Whether I'm on the fan side of the ropes or the driver's side of the ropes, I enjoyed the sport. And that is true. But it's also true that I thought, God, there's just something about putting that fire suit on a Sunday. And I just thought that was never going to happen again for me until I got a call in in, I guess it was late June or early July of 2024. And I was asked to fill in for John Force and get in that Peak Chevrolet Camaro. And I still kind of pinch myself. I mean, we're sitting here in John's museum in front of all of his cars and trophies and all the things that he's accumulated over the years. And I don't know if I ever thought, man, one day I get to sit in John's car and stomp on that throttle, and this is the day. If you want to know who Jack Beckman is, that's different things over the years, right? So I'm 58 years old. I have a 17-year-old son, Jason, 13-year-old daughter, Layla. Both my kids enjoy ice hockey. I'm not a fan of ice hockey for 3 reasons. It's cold, it's expensive, and it's too early in the morning. But I like that they have a passion. My son also loves roundy round racing. And I was thinking about doing a paternity test, but he's definitely my kid. And I'm fine with whatever he wants to do. And my daughter's a wonderful artist. She's got a tremendous amount of talent, and I'd love to nurture that in her. And I'm an elevator guy. I mean, I really went back to work as just a blue-collar guy, and it wasn't a woe is me moment. It was I am so lucky that after 22 years away from the elevator trade, the same company hired me back, and it's a great industry. It's a great trade. I actually really enjoy the work. And I'm a part-time funny car driver again now, and it just feels so cool to be back in the mix. I had been offered different rides over the last few years, but I have to make money doing this now. It's not like 30 years ago where I would have paid money to drive a race car. I've got 2 kids that I need to support. I've got rent payments. And so I look at things a little bit differently now. And it's hard not to get jaded when you get paid for 14 years to do something. And I loved racing, and I was just passionate about putting all my effort into it when I was in my 20s and 30s. But as your obligations increase as you get older, and it's a job, sometimes you forget how cool it is. And I think I was pretty good about recognizing how fortunate I was when I had that job. But then the 3 years and 9 months when I wasn't a driver, I realized how much I missed it. At least I thought I realized how much I missed it. I think the reality is I tried not to think about it because I probably would have missed it way more than I would have been comfortable with. But climbing back in that car, went back and drove John's car at Norwalk this year to re-up my license, and my first race back was at the NHRA event in Brainerd. And man, when those fans showed up, and I never got in a race car because I wanted to be cool with the fans. I got in a race car because race cars are cool. But when the fans show up and the stands are packed, and then you step on that throttle for the first time, and you make a good run, and then you tow back in front and the fans are cheering again, I really, really miss that. And I got to tell you, it's good to be back. Ironically, when I first got into a Nitro funny car in 2006, it was replacing a driver, and I think there was 5 or 6 races in the season. Now, fast forward to 2024, after John's injury, and the new NHRA policy where a replacement driver could earn points for 8 races, that was a pretty easy deal to decide that I would fill in for John for the last 8 races. And that can be really awkward. But it wasn't at all. The awkward part is I hadn't stepped on the throttle for 3 years and 9 months, and I didn't have a license that was still current. So we had to get that taken care of. And I think a lot of what made the transition easier is for the crew chiefs. I got Chris Cunningham, Danny Hood, and Tim Fabrizi. Well, Chris Cunningham was one of my crew chiefs years and years ago, so there's a high comfort level there. I know Danny Hood. Tim Fabrizi and I had stayed in touch. Every time I come to Pomona, I'd stop by the pits to say hi to John and the crew guys. And then I had driven a top alcohol dragster in 2003, 4, 5. And Sterling Van Duzen, who does the clutch on John Force's Peak Camaro, was one of the crew guys on that car. And he was a crew guy for me in 2014, which arguably was my toughest year in drag racing. It's the only year I never won a single event. Well, so 5 races into this replacement driving gig, we went out in St. Louis. And the reaction on all the crew guys told me everything I needed to know. They'd already won twice this year with John. I was filling in for the greatest drag racer in the history of the sport. And Those guys sat out several races and weren't sure what the future looked like for them. So for us to be able to close the deal at St. Louis was unbelievable. Well, Sterling walked up to me and he said, "We just wrapped up unfinished business. It's full circle now." To know you have a car and a team capable of winning is one thing. To stand there at the end of the day with that car, that crew, and that trophy, you sealed the deal.